Danny, Brother Danny, dahil baka daw mahuli, baka hindi umabot sa time. Okay. Yung po mga nakaraang sessions, meron po ba kayong tanong doon habang inaantay natin si Myra? Nagawa nyo na yung preparatory bago pumasok sa klase? Right?
Hello, brother. Natidinig ba ako?
Ha?
Natidinig niyo ako?
Opo, opo.
Oo. Brother, yung sinasabi niyong preparatory,
Yeah.
ano yung mga reading materials?
Opo, in-upload ko na yun. In-upload ko na.
Nabuksan ko po yun. Kaya lang, yung isa yung, ilimbawa, yung timeline, babasahin ba yun ang haba? Aling portion yun?
Paste ninyo. Pag dugtong-dugtongin ninyo, baliktaran yun, ha? Pag prinente nyo yung baliktaran, makuha nyo yun, piprintin nyo yung back-to-back niyan. And then,
brother, alin doon? Yung, kasi apat na piraso yung, yung materials.
Opo.
Alin yung back-to-back? Yung una?
Yung timeline.
Yung timeline?
Timeline mismo. Pag dudugtong-dugtongin ninyo yun.
Tapos brother, hindi ba mahaba yun? Buong libro yun eh. Alin ang babasa? Anong part ng babasahin namin doon? Hanggang anong chapter?
Yung question. Yung bawat session natin. May mga question doon bawat session.
Opo. Pero
kunyari ngayon, Patriarch, dapat binasa nyo na yung questions para sa Patriarch.
Para sa Patriarch?
Opo. And then, makikinig tayo sa presentation. And then, yun ang pinaka-lecture. And then after that, bibigay yung responses. Okay. Pakinggan muna natin si Sister Mai. Saglit lang daw po.
And then I missed my bus. So I'm driving down the street. How can I get hit by no, I don't buy it. You don't believe me? I've got antlers inside of my mother's car. No, you have to let me take this test. I'm ready for this test. I know everything there is to know about sheets. Okay, you need to calm down now. I am Murphy, and his mother thinks that we're easy. And just what is wrong with you, huh? You already have everything. You already have the grades and status. The hell is wrong with you that you have this constant need to be the biggest jerk in the entire world? Let's go. Huh? What's up? What's up with me?
Brother Dado, yung cover, pag tingnan niyo yung cover, saka yung questions, itong questions ang babasahin ninyo. And then yung responses, ibibigay namin sa inyo afterwards. Yung Bible Timeline handout, inset, yun yung ipiprint niyo ng dikit-dikit para makita niyo yung haba nung tawag dito, yung pinaka-inset yun eh. Parang papa yun eh.
So brother, every end of the session, sasabihin nyo kung ano yung susunod na...
Yeah. Nakalagay naman doon. Ang topic, ngayon, dapat nabasa nyo na yung Patriarch 1 at saka Patriarch 2 at saka yung Egypt Part 1.
Oh, hindi ko nalaman na yan.
Opo.
So bago tayo maghiwa-hiwalay, sasabihin nyo kung ano yung...
Hindi na, naka-sequence na yun. Naka-sequence na. Pero sige, re-remind ko kayo, don't worry. Okay. Sige.
Okay po.
Bakit nag-present si Brother Louie? Brother Louie? Brother Louie, ba't ka nag-present?
Hello, naririnig na po.
Oo. Sige. Bakit nag-present si Brother Louie? Ay, ikaw ba yun?
Ay, hindi po. Baka may napindot lang siya.
Brother Louie, nag-present ka ba?
May napindot yan. But, Brother Louie, stop presenting ka. Hindi makapag-present si Ate Myra.
Brother Louie.
Kuya Louie. May napindot siya. May napindot.
Brother Louie, stop presenting. Stop presenting. Hindi pa rin siya. Nag-leave ka nga, pero bakit nandito pa presentation mo?
Baka dalawang gadget nakabukas sa kanya.
Paano ba natin natatawagan si Brother Louie? Brother Louie. Brother Louie. Brother Louie.
May gumagamit siguro na ibang tao yung gadget niya eh. Hindi siya. Pero naka-open sa atin. Tinatawagan ko, hindi sumasagot eh.
Ay gumagamit sa kanya ng phone eh. Ay, sarado ko muna po ha. Sarado ko muna yung and then balik na lang kayo ha. Para makakuha tayo dahil hindi yata marinig ni Brother Louie. Pasok na lang kayo mamaya. Sarado ko muna.
Okay, okay.
Introduction. These sections refer to sagas or long stories about certain people. It follows the story of the dispersion of people after the Tower of Babel event. The patriarchs refer to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the sub-story for Joseph. The context of the prior talk was the increase in evil and the signs God has given them for protection purposes. But after the Tower of Babel event, we do not have a sign to show the protection of God. Now, the story of Abraham follows the Babel event and shows the sign of protection.
Bakit mahina?
Mahina, walang marinig.
Meron na ako sa
Mahina po ba? Low?
Ate Mayra, mahina.
Mahina, walang audio.
Thank you.
Pero,
Sandali lang.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay po.
Very good. Sige.
Okay po. Sige. Simulan natin. Hello?
Yeah, sige. Sige, Bray.
Introduction. These sections refer to sagas or long stories about certain people. It follows the story of the dispersion of people after the Tower of Babel event. The patriarchs refer to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with a sub-story for Joseph. The context of the prior talk was the increase in evil and the signs God has given them for protection purposes. But after the Tower of Babel event, we do not have a sign to show the protection of God. Now, the story of Abraham follows the Babel event and shows the sign of protection God has for people. God calls Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, Genesis chapter 12 verse 1. Out of the goodness of God, he calls Abram from the Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham and Nahor, sons of Terah, lived in those areas and are serving other gods. Abram was called out of Ur and led him to the land of Canaan, where God increased them and blessed them. God's blessing was given to Abram with the end in view of manifesting it to the world. However, Abram's wife Sarai was barren. The blessing Abram received from God may not be fulfilled because of this barren condition of Sarai. What Abram did was to bring along Lot, a nephew, as an insurance policy. In the event the promise is not fulfilled, this can be fulfilled in Lot. Lot was not required to go with Abram. The Bible just says Lot went with him. This is a sad situation, showing Abram lacked the proper belief in the promise of God. God calls Abram from Ur. The destination is Canaan. When they reached it, he built an altar Shechem, or the oak at Moreh, Genesis chapter 12 verse 6. Another between Ai and Bethel east and west, Genesis chapter 12 verse 8. Journey to the south into the Negev, Genesis chapter 12 verse 9. He went back to Ai and Bethel, Genesis chapter 13 verse 3 to 4, and viewed the land from the north, south, east, and west. By building altars in the north, middle, and south, Abram virtually took possession of the land. God's promises to Abram, Genesis chapter 12 verses 2 to 3. When God called Abram, he made him a promise of land or Ered, kingdom through his offspring or Em, and blessing through the covenant or Berit. As we go through the Bible, we will find that these promises have been realized in Abraham. But we have a problem. Abram has no offspring, because Sarai was barren and had no land. Testing and blessing. The famine was so intense that Abram decided to go to Egypt. In this episode, we see Abram as not trusting the Lord enough that he used a scheme to avoid being killed by Pharaoh. That, however, brought the ants stress in distress, having become part of Pharaoh's harem. God afflicted Pharaoh, and upon knowing the reason, sent for Abram and sent them off out of Egypt. Abram went back to the place where he was before, at Bethel. Another difficulty met was when Lot wanted to separate from Abram because of the strife between their herders of flocks. Thus, Abram's insurance was lost. Further, there was a war between a confederation of 5 kings against 4 kings. Sodom and Gomorrah were taken as prisoners, Lot included. When Abram heard of it, he pursued them and rescued Lot. After the rescue, they were met by Melchizedek, meaning "my kingdom is righteous," who blessed Abram. Melchizedek was said to be the king of Salem or Salem. He was a priest of God Most High. Some Jewish exegetes say that he was Noah's son Shem. We will recall in Hebrews chapter 7 verses 1 to 3, that Christ was called the priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. God's covenant with Abraham, a blueprint for the rest of the story. The land of promise deep in Genesis chapter 15. This episode talks about the covenant cut by God with Abram. This is called a Sunka unilateral promise. It was God who made a promise. Abram has no part in it except as the passive receiver of the promise. The covenant was made with the heifer cut in half, and the Lord passed between the cut parts. The meaning of passing between the cut parts is, may God do to me what was done to these animals if I do not abide by the terms of this covenant. That is the essence of the covenantal ritual and the meaning of blood, the sealing of the covenant. The promise was for a multitude of offspring like the stars and the sand. The covenant, according to Frank Norcross Jr., D.J. McCarthy, and Moshe Weinfeld, is in essence a legal means to establish kinship between 2 previously unrelated parties. Thus, duties and privileges of kinship may be extended to another individual or group, including aliens. In Genesis chapter 12, the promise was made and became explicit in Genesis chapter 15. When the covenant was cut and made more manifest in Genesis chapter 17, when Sarah will become pregnant in the coming year. In Genesis chapter 22, however, is the act where God tested Abram on whether he can part with Isaac, the boy of promise, by offering him as a burnt offering. Thus God is going to fulfill everything that he has promised. Another insurance policy, Hagar, Genesis chapter 16. In the episode on Hagar, we find the doubt still in Abram's mind. First, his insurance was Lot. Secondly, he designated Eliezer his servant as heir. Third, Hagar, the concubine, was to be a surrogate mother for the promised son. The offspring of Hagar is Ismail, the father of the Arab nations. We find in this episode similar language construct to the fall narrative. The woman took the initiative to be like God by a possible circumvention of the promise. The kingdom promise deepened, Genesis chapter 17. The episode talks about the covenant sign, which is circumcision. Thus, the promise of the kingdom is becoming a reality when his multitude of offspring came to be a reality. Everyone was circumcised, including Abram, who was renamed Abraham, and Ishmael, and all their male servants. The upcoming reality of a multitude of offspring will bring about the kingdom. From these offsprings will come kings with a view of the dynasty of David. In the episode of Isaac, the story about laughter is very prominent. The promised son will cause laughter in the family. Abraham intercedes for Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis chapter 19. In Genesis chapter 19, God was revealing to Abraham his plan to level off Sodom and Gomorrah. With that revelation, Abraham was concerned about Lot, whom he knew was living there. With this in mind, he interceded for the lives of the righteous ones there. Then the haggling begins. From 50 to about 10, God will not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of 10 righteous people. However, please note that Lot, his wife, and his 2 children only come up to 4 righteous people. The ultimate test and a covenant of worldwide blessing, Genesis chapter 22. The ACTA is brought up as a test. The text says explicitly so. However, the character of the story does not know that. The test was meant to determine whether the trust of Abraham to the Lord is complete. Prior to the ACTA, Abraham was ambivalent. He was fearful and would not want to be killed. After the ACTA, he was a different man. He can even part with the only link to his future, his son. He found a lamb as a substitute for Isaac, which became the norm in subsequent offerings. You can also look to Leviticus about this. Adonai Jireh, God will provide, is the central theme of the call of Abraham. The family grows, a wife for Isaac, Genesis chapter 24. The family now grows by getting a wife for the promised son. The episode is told in Genesis chapter 24 about the servant of Abraham who was tasked to look for a wife for Isaac. He met her brother Laban and the mother, and after introductions and realizations, they let Rebekah go to Isaac to become his wife.
So dito nakita natin yung tawag kay Abraham. O nagsimula muna kay Abram, tapos later on, nung tumugon siya, nakita natin yung pagtugon niya, bagamat sabi nga nung nakita natin dun sa storya ni Abraham, tinawag siya, tumugon, pero yung pagtugon niya hindi pa ganoon ka firm, hindi pa ganoon yung trust niya sa ating Panginoon. So doon lang naipakita niya yung total trust niya sa Panginoon doon sa akida, kung saan inutos ng Panginoon na ialay sa kanya yung kanyang nag-iisang anak na si Isaac. So doon, sa pagsunod ni Abraham, pinatunayan niya sa Diyos yung kanyang katapatan. Na kahit yung kaisa-isang anak na sinasabing magbibigay sa kanya ng maraming offspring, magbibigay sa kanya ng masaganang lupa at yung pamamahala doon, kumbaga sa action doon ni Abraham, na ipakita niya ang kanyang pagtitiwala. So makikita natin yung maturity ng faith, pero sabi nga natin ang pinaka-center ng tawag ni Abraham is God will provide. So with that, maraming salamat po, at tunghayan naman natin yung susunod na presenter para sa part 2 ng Patriarch. Maraming salamat po. Magandang gabi.
Thank you, Sir Myra. Kung ready na po si Brother June, pakit mo na po.
Wait lang po.
Okay, sige po.
Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Ang presentation ko po sa gabing ito is about Patriarchs Part 2. This is under or canonical reading of the scripture class. Introduction to Patriarchs Part 2. This section shows the continuation of the narrative about the patriarchs and the handling on the blessing. It treats of the saga of Isaac partly, Jacob, and the story of Joseph. The context of the prior saga of Abraham is the promise made by God to give him the threefold promise of land, kingdom, and blessing. The episodes that would follow include the situations of Isaac, the cunning of Jacob, and the delightful story of Joseph, and how the family came to be in Egypt. Jacob and Esau, Genesis chapter 25, verse 29 to 34. Birthright. For the ancients, the birthright is a sacred thing. It connotes leadership, responsibility, and double inheritance. Ano ba itong leadership sa mga Israelis, no? In the Bible. Leadership in the Bible is about caring and serving others with humility and courage and bringing them closer to God. Ito namang double inheritance and responsibility. For the Israelites, the birthright son was entitled to a double portion, that is twice as much as the other sons of the father's inheritance. It is one portion as a son, and the second portion as the new head responsible for the family. This is written in Genesis 48:22 and Deuteronomy 21:17. And thus, responsibilities include the care of his mother and unmarried sisters. Inheritance. Inheritance plays a big part in the lives of the patriarchs. However, Genesis defiantly pushes against the social norms. The codes of Lipit Istar and the Hammurabi Code dictate that a man give his sons equal shares of land, but Abraham gives Ismail no inheritance. His youngest sons by his concubine Keturah a small portion before his death, and Isaac the vast majority of his estate. Genesis 25:1-11. Isaac, on the other hand, attempts to give his eldest son a double inheritance, but it was stolen by Jacob. Genesis 27. Jacob, in his story and in his deathbed, gave Joseph, saying, "Unto you I give one more ridge of land than to your brothers. The ridge I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow." Genesis 48:22. Additionally, Jacob adopted Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph's sons, in order to give them equal portions of Joseph's brothers. Genesis 48. This Jacob only did for Joseph's sons. Thus, one could argue that through Ephraim and Manasseh, Jacob gave Joseph far more than his brothers, roughly 4 times their portion. The firstborn receives twice what the other siblings will receive. It is a great privilege for a man to be the firstborn. It is through the firstborn, in the case of Abraham, that the blessing will flow. By the way, what is what is a firstborn? The firstborn born of a mother is referred to in the Bible as, in Exodus 13:2, as one who opens the womb of his mother. But in the case of the Israelites, the firstborn is being assumed mostly by the firstborn son of the legal wife, not the concubine or from another woman. Esau did not treat his birthright with care, but traded it for a bowl of stew. He married a Canaanite woman, indicated that he does not care about the responsibilities of the firstborn. Ano ba itong Canaanite woman? Na-mention itong Canaanite woman na ito because of Isaac, no? His father was Abraham. No? In choosing a wife for Isaac, ang instruction ni Abraham ay kasi Abraham kasi siya ay nakatira sa Canaan. Abraham lived in Canaan and did not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman because the Canaanites worship false gods. Abraham wanted Isaac to marry a righteous woman who would help him remain faithful to the living God and who would teach their children the truth. Excuse me. In Hebrew 12:16-17, Esau was called profane since he treated what was considered holy in ancient time as a common thing. Blessing. Blessing in the Bible suggests an intimate relationship between the blesser and the blessed. A blessing from God marks an intimate relationship between God and man, serving as proof that he finds himself in God's favor. The concept of blessing connotes prosperity, vitality, and fertility. So sa mga Israelis, kung marami yung flock of cows or sheep or goats, tatawagin kang prosperous, no? Vitality, kung matipuno ang katawan, walang sakit, ganun. And fertility, no? Kung ang babae ay maraming anak, ay sasabihin na blessed, no? Kaya ang mga karamihan sa babae, example si Sarai and Rachel ay tinatawag na hindi malapit sa Diyos or kasi they were abaw nga sila. Sunod. It is a word that has blessing is a word that has an efficacious meaning to the life of those blessed. For the Jews, blessing is not merely sound coming from the mouth, but a reality apart from the one who enunciated the blessing. It is an entity by itself that goes around the world and returns to the enunciator and carries every good things that the word passes by. A curse, on the other hand, has the reverse effect. The intention of Isaac was to give the blessing to Esau. Rebekah, probably knowing that Esau violated his being a firstborn by marrying a Canaanite woman, assisted Jacob to secure the blessing out of Isaac through deception. Sige. Consequences of Jacob's deception. The deception brought various ills and torments that Jacob has to endure. He fled the warmth of home and went to Haran to live as an exile. He went to his mother's family and served his uncle Laban. The wrath of Esau was palpable since he was cheated out of his birthright. Isaac has no more blessing to give him because that was given already to Jacob. In the Laban cycle, Jacob was meted out the same treatment as he treated Esau. The ladder and the blessing. The dream of the ladder reverses what happened to the Tower of Babel. God indicated to Jacob that he will always be with him and that angels protect him in his ways. This is contrary to what happened to the people who constructed the Tower of Babel. No, they were dispersed. The blessing was renewed in Jacob, and in return, Jacob worshipped God by offering him oil on the stone he was lying on, and made a promise of tithes from his produces. Jacob is Jacobed. Genesis 29, verses 1 to 30. In this story, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him Leah instead of Rachel, for whom Jacob served 7 years. Upon knowing the deception, he accosted Laban with, "Why then have you deceived me?" Genesis 29, verse 25. It seems that his past is running after him. Jacob's 12 sons. The story of the birth of the 12 sons is a story of competition between the two wives. Leah was very fertile, whereas Rachel was not. Rachel gave her handmaid Bilhah to Jacob as surrogate mother, so that through her, Rachel could have children as well. In like manner, Leah gave her handmaid Zilpah as surrogate for 2 sons. Then again, Leah became fertile and gave birth to 2 more. Then God remembered Rachel, and she gave birth to 2. Jacob wrestles with God and Peniel. After the disagreements with Laban, departed ways, and Jacob wanted to return home. Knowing that Esau is bound to meet him, he divided his company and sent the first part before him, so that should Esau meet them, they would say that the flocks were presents for Esau, and that Jacob is behind them. Jacob sent the mothers and the children across the Jabbok River, and was left alone to wrestle with the man. He prevailed against him and obtained blessing from him with a change in name from Jacob to Israel, meaning one who wrestles with God. Jacob encounters Esau. In the final analysis, the brothers will have to meet. Jacob was much afraid, and to find favor, he bowed himself 7 times until he came to Esau. There was the reconciling embrace between the brothers. Jacob insisted that Esau receive the flocks and that he go ahead with the flocks, saying that the flocks may die if they accompany them. That the children also. Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Ang presentation flocks were presents for Esau, and that Jacob is behind them. Jacob sent the mothers and the children across the Jabbok River and was left alone to wrestle with the man. He prevailed against him and obtained blessing from him with a change in name from Jacob to Israel, meaning one who wrestles with God. Jacob encounters Esau. In the final analysis, the brothers will have to meet. Jacob was much afraid, and to find favor, he bowed himself 7 times until he came to Esau. There was the reconciling embrace between the brothers. Jacob insisted that Esau receive the flocks and that he go ahead with the flocks, saying that the flocks may die if they accompany them, that the children also are nursing. Jacob finally came to Canaan and dwelt in Sukkot. Rape and revenge at Shechem. Jacob has a daughter named Dinah. The prince Shechem saw her. He raped her, but fell deeply in love with her. He asked his father Hamor to make representation to give her in marriage. Jacob and the sons talked with Hamor about the proposed marriage. The sons of Jacob deceitfully dealt with him, saying that they would only agree if all males will be circumcised. Hamor and Shechem talked to their people and told that they can benefit from making the Israelites as one people because of their wealth. Thus, they had themselves circumcised. While in pain, Simeon and Levi attacked them and slaughtered them, plundered them because of the rape of Dinah. Joseph, Genesis 35 to 50. Joseph's quote. Joseph, the child of his beloved Rachel. Jacob loved Joseph more than the others. He gave him a robe with sleeves. This has caused hatred to the other children. They hated Jacob for this. Joseph even gave Jacob bad reports about his siblings when they were pasturing the flock. The coat thus became a symbol of the hatred the siblings had with Joseph. Joseph's dreams. Joseph had 2 dreams, which for the Israelites of the time are revelatory. The first dream was about sheaves. Joseph's sheaves stood up, and the sheaves of the other children bowed to it. The siblings became angry, knowing that this means that they would be serving him. The second dream was like the first. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing before Joseph. Thus, even Jacob was concerned about him, the mother and the children bowing before Joseph. The more the children became angry at him. Joseph sold into slavery. The dream has kept the feeling of anger deep within the soul of each of the children. When Jacob sent Joseph to inquire about the children tending the flock, the siblings conspired to kill him. Reuben, however, would like none of it. They sent him down into the pit with the intent of letting him die. In the morning, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. They drew Joseph from the pit and sold him to slavery. We see here the murderous intent of the brothers to dispose of their siblings. Judah and Joseph, 2 brothers contrasted. Genesis 38 to 39. Judah had a son who died without leaving an heir. Levirate laws indicate that the second son should marry the widow and raise a son for the deceased. But Onan would not like to and wasted his seed. He died too. Only the youngest was left, Shelah, but not a marrying age yet. When the son grew up, he was not given to Tamar. She disguised herself as a prostitute and lied with Judah, securing a pledge from him for the service. When the payment was to be made to Tamar, she was nowhere to be found. Tamar became pregnant, and Judah would like to burn her to death. But Tamar showed the pledge, and Judah acknowledged his fault. Joseph, on the other hand, was sold to Potiphar. Since God blessed Joseph, Potiphar's affairs were very well. Went very well. Excuse me. Joseph was in charge of the household. As a handsome fellow, the wife of Potiphar seduced them, but every time this was done, Joseph would not have anything to do with it. The wife found a way of putting Joseph in a bad light, and he was imprisoned. However, God made everything that Joseph did prosper. Joseph in prison, Genesis 39 to 41. In prison, he was a favored prisoner. In an instance, he was with Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Both had dreams nobody could interpret for them. God gave the gift of interpretation to Joseph and told the cupbearer that his dream meant that he would be restored to his office, but that the baker will be hanged in 3 days' time. The interpretation happened, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. Then Pharaoh had 2 dreams too. The first was 7 fat cows, and thereafter 7 thin cows. The second was 7 fat ears of corn, and then 7 thin ears of corn. No one of the magicians could interpret for him. Therewith, the cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him. Pharaoh sent for him, and Joseph interpreted the dream for him. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. He recommended to Pharaoh to assign a man to supervise the grain taking during the 7 years of plenty, and to distribute the grains during the next 7 years. Joseph set over the land of Egypt. Genesis 41 and following verses. Pharaoh appointed Joseph to supervise such an endeavor. Everything except the throne is under Joseph's command. He was in charge of the whole household of Pharaoh. Famine and testing. When the 7 years of famine came, Joseph sold grains to the Egyptians and even to the outsiders, since the famine was so severe. At this point, Jacob set his sons, except Benjamin, to go to Egypt to buy food. Here, Joseph saw them and tested them if they have changed. Joseph charged them that they were spies. They said that they weren't, and even volunteered information about their father and the last brother. Through ruse, he placed back the money on top of the sack when they went home. When they saw this, they were dismayed. After consuming the food, Jacob again sent them to buy, but since Joseph expressly told them to bring along Benjamin, they would not, for fear of Joseph. After much coaching, Jacob sent Benjamin with them to Joseph. He invited them to dine with him. When they were to return home, Joseph placed his divining cup with the sack of Benjamin. He went back to the palace to explain. Joseph would want to have Benjamin be his slave. Judas steps up. Here, Judas steps in to explain the situation about their father dying if they can bring Benjamin back to him. After a very tearful explanation, Joseph revealed himself to them that he is Joseph, their brother. Pharaoh, upon learning about this, approved that Jacob and his family settle in Egypt. Joseph selected Goshen to be the place where they can stay. Resolution. The reconciliation of the brothers brought about a very long family dysfunction into its proper setting. The family became whole again, and they lived in the comfort of Egypt. This, however, is at variance with the promise of land. Jacob's family moves to Egypt. The blessing passed down, Genesis 47 to 50. Because of this situation, Jacob went into Egypt, little knowing that they would stay there for 400 years as an oppressed people. The story, however, indicates the passing down of the blessing to the next generation. The blessing, however, did not pass through Reuben, who violated his birthright by defiling his father's bed, nor to Simeon and Levi, the massacred men, and as such will be scattered throughout Israel. Simeon was lost as a tribe, and Levi did not have any inheritance. Thus, the birthright passed on to the fourth, who is Judah. Conclusion. Thus ends the era of the patriarchs. The continuation of the blessing is told in the generations that followed. They have been able to extend the family so much that by the time of the Exodus, they are too numerous to count, just like the promise of God to Abraham. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Brother June. All right. So, tingnan po natin yung Egypt naman, part 1. At lang po. All right. Lecture 6, Egypt and Exodus, Part 1. Introduction to Egypt and Exodus, Part 1. These sections will treat the stories of Jacob and his children were settled in Egypt. Due to the famine that they underwent in Canaan, the brothers sought grain from Egypt, where their brother Joseph has been installed as vizier of Egypt. Although contrary to the promise, God has provided and guided them in his journey. The succeeding Pharaoh did not know about Joseph. Seeing that the Hebrews were increasing in number, he thought that they are a threat to the country and enslaved them. Thus begins the story of Exodus. God calls Moses, Exodus 1-4. The Egyptian oppression of God's firstborn, Israel. As indicated, the present Pharaoh did not know about Joseph, nor of his deeds about the famine. Fearing that they will side with their enemies in battle, the Egyptians oppressed them so. They made them do hard labor, particularly in their city building. The tasks are too hard that Israelites were groaning in slavery. Another strategy in Pharaoh's order is for the midwives. They were tasked with killing the baby, if it were a boy. However, the account indicates that the midwives feared God and did not do as Pharaoh had commanded. Then they ordered to throw into the Nile all boys born of Hebrew women. This is another oppression in store for the Hebrews. The birth of Moses, Moshe, to draw out. Moshe was born to the Levite couple Amram and Yochebed, according to the Talmud. Due to the order to kill every male child born of Hebrew parents, the mother hid Moshe for 3 months. When it was no longer possible, she got a papyrus basket and plastered it with bitumen and pitch and let it float on the Nile River. Miriam, the eldest daughter, followed the basket. It was found by the daughter of Pharaoh. Miriam approached the princess and inquired if she would like someone to nurse for the baby. When the princess consented, Miriam brought his mother along, and she was asked to nurture Moshe for her. He was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh and was raised in the palace. Once he saw an Egyptian maltreating the fellow Hebrew, and in ensuing altercation, he slew the Egyptian. This was made known when he was interceding for two Hebrews fighting each other. Pharaoh came to know of it, and he sought to kill Moses. Moses fled to the wilderness. Moses fled and came to Midian, where he saw, as a well, the daughters of the Midian priest Reuel. Moses defended the girls from the shepherd at the watering hole. He watered the flock of the girls. When Reuben came to know about it, he asked him to come to him. Later he gave Zipporah to Moses in marriage. The couple bore Gershom, meaning a man in a foreign land. The burning bush, Exodus 3. Moses was preparing Reuel's flock. Once he saw a bush burning, but was not consumed by the fire. He drew near and was commissioned by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The manifestation of God, or of his theophany, or appearance of God, includes the following. 1. That he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a continuation of the promise. Number 2, that God has seen the affliction of the children of Israel. Number 3, that God will send Moses, and that God will be with Moses. Number 4, the signs that will be given is in order for them to worship God in the mountain. He asked God what name he will be telling the Israelites. He said the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, which means I am who I am, or I will be what I will be. The revelation of the name gave access to the children of Israel to love and follow God, just as the power to name given to Adam gave him authority over all creation. The giving by God of his name to Israel gave them the privilege to have access to him, but not power over him. The Tetragrammaton is not a name per se, but God's being existent. The term Alpha and Omega is an inclusive term. It means everything. These are the letters of Aleph and Tav in the Hebrew script. According to Sefer Hashiel, Talmud has 14 letters for the name of God. Otherwise, some says it's 72 letters in Exodus 14:19 to 21. This is the unpronounceable name of God. The request, a 3 days journey to worship God. The delegation of Moses will have to make a representation with Pharaoh to a 3-day journey to the wilderness to worship God. But Pharaoh saw this as a disguise to loaf off from work. Thus he hardened his heart and would not let the people go. The battle for Israel. Let my son go, that he may serve me. Exodus 5-6. Will they work, avad, for Pharaoh, or serve, avad, God? After Moses had spoken to Pharaoh about letting the people worship in the desert, he makes the taskmaster more ruthless to the slave. He did not give them straw to make the bricks. They have to secure straw for themselves without lessening the daily required output. The Israelites complained against Moses, and Moses asked the Lord about it. God made the solemn promise that he will let the people go. They will go no longer avad for Pharaoh, but they will avad God. Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Any pleading of Moses and Aaron ends in deaf ears. Pharaoh's heart became hard and would not make the people of God go. The hardening of heart is not caused by God, but allowed by God in the desire of Pharaoh not to let the people worship in the desert. Pharaoh, I do not know the Lord. 5:2. Pharaoh is considered a god in Egypt over life and death. Thus, when Moses presented to Pharaoh the request to let Israel worship God in the desert, it was a confrontation between the God and Pharaoh claiming to be God. When he said, I do not know the Lord, he was enunciating the belief that he is God in Egypt and that Egypt has a repertoire of gods. The 10 plagues. Exodus 7 to 12. The strike against the false gods of Egypt. The 10 plagues of Egypt, also known as the 10 plagues, the plagues of Egypt, or the biblical plagues, are described in Exodus 7 to 12. The plagues were the 10 disasters sent upon Egypt by God to convince Pharaoh to free the Israelite slaves from the bondage and oppression they had endured in Egypt for 400 years. When God sent Moses to deliver the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt, he promised to show his wonders and confirmation of Moses' authority. Exodus 3:20. This confirmation was to serve at least two purposes: to show the Israelites that the God of their fathers was alive and worthy of their worship, and to show the Egyptians that their gods were nothing. The Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for about 400 years, and in that time had lost faith in the God of their fathers. They believed he existed and worshipped him, but they doubted that he could or would break the yoke of their bondage. The Egyptians, like many pagan cultures, worshipped a wide variety of nature gods and attributed to their power the natural phenomena they saw in the world around them. There was a god of the sun, of the Nile, of childbirth, of crops, etc. Events like the annual flooding of the Nile, which fertilized their croplands, were evidence of their God's powers and goodwill. When Moses approached Pharaoh demanding that he let the people go, Pharaoh responded by saying, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Exodus 5:2. Thus began the challenge to show God was more powerful. The first plague, turning the Nile to blood, was a judgment against Apis, the god of the Nile, Isis, the goddess of the Nile, and Gnum, the guardian of the Nile. The Nile was also believed to be the bloodstream of Osiris, who was reborn each year when the river flooded. The river, which formed the base of daily life and the national economy, was devastated, as millions of fish died in the river and the water was unusable. Pharaoh was told, "By this you will know that I am the Lord." Exodus 7:17. The second plague, bringing frogs from the Nile, was a judgment against Heket, the frog-headed goddess of birth. Frogs were thought to be sacred and not to be killed. God had the frogs invade every part of the homes of the Egyptians, and when they died, their stinking bodies were heaped up in offensive piles all around the land. Exodus 8:13-14. The third plague, Gnat, was a judgment of Set, the god of the desert. Unlike the previous plagues, the magicians were unable to duplicate this one, and declared to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Exodus 8:19. The fourth plague, flies, was a judgment against either Re or Watchit, who were both depicted as flies. In this plague, God clearly distinguished between the Israelites and the Egyptians, as no swarms of flies bothered the areas where the Israelites lived. Exodus 8:21-24. The fifth plague, the death of the livestock, was a judgment on the goddess Hathor and the god Apis, who were both depicted as cattle. As with the previous plagues, God protected his people from the plague, while the cattle of the Egyptians all died. God was steadily destroying the economy of Egypt, while showing his ability to protect and provide for those who obeyed him. Pharaoh even sent investigators, Exodus 9:17, to find out if the Israelites were suffering along with the Egyptians, but the result was a hardening of his heart against them. The sixth plague, boils, was a judgment against several gods over health and disease, Sekhmet, Suno, and Isis. This time the Bible says that the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. Clearly, these religious leaders were powerless against the God of Israel. Before God sent the last three plagues, Pharaoh was given a special message from God. These plagues would be more severe than the others, and they were designed to convince Pharaoh and all the people that there is none like me in all the land.
Exodus 9:14. Pharaoh was even told that he was placed in his position by God, so that God would show his power and declare his name through all the earth. As an example of his grace, God warned Pharaoh to gather whatever cattle and crop remained from the previous plagues and shelter them from the coming storm. Some of Pharaoh's servants heeded the warning, verse 20, while others did not. The seventh plague, hail, attacked Nut, the sky goddess, Osiris, the crop fertility god, and Set, the storm god. This hail was unlike any that has been seen before. It was accompanied by a fire which ran along the ground, and everything left out in the open was devastated by the hail and fire. Again, the children of Israel were miraculously protected, and no hail damaged anything in their land. Before God brought the next plague, he told Moses that the Israelites would be able to tell their children of these things that had seen God do in Egypt, and how it showed them God's power. The eighth plague, locust, again focused on Nut, Osiris, and Set. The latter crops, wheat and rye, which had survived the hail, were now devoured by the swarm of locusts. There would be no harvest in Egypt that year. The ninth plague, darkness, was aimed at the sun god, Re, who was symbolized by the Pharaoh himself. For 3 days the land of Egypt was smothered with unearthly darkness, but the homes of the Israelites had light. The 10th plague, death of Egypt's firstborn, chapter 12. See Numbers 33:4. The 10th and last plague, the death of the firstborn males, was a judgment on Isis, the protector of children. In this plague, God was teaching the Israelites a deep spiritual lessons which pointed to Christ. Unlike the other plague which the Israelites survived by virtue of their identity as God's people, this plague required an act of faith by them. God commanded each family to take an unblemished male lamb and kill it. The blood of the lamb was to be smeared on the top and sides of their doorways, and the lamb was to be roasted and eaten that night. Any family that did not follow God's instructions would suffer in the last plague. God described how he would send a death angel to the land of Egypt with orders to slay the firstborn male in every household, whether human or animal. The only protection was the blood of the lamb on the door. When the angel saw the blood, he would pass over that house and leave it untouched. Exodus 12:23. This is where the term Passover comes from. It is a memorial of that night of ancient Egypt when God delivered his people from the bondage. 1 Corinthians 5:7 teaches that Jesus became our Passover when he died to deliver us from the bondage of sin. While the Israelites found God's protection in their homes, every other home in the land of Egypt experienced God's wrath as their loved ones died. This grievous event caused Pharaoh to finally release the Israelites. By the time the Israelites left Egypt, they had a clear picture of God's power, God's protection, and God's plan for them. For those who were willing to believe, they had convincing evidence that they served the true living God. Sadly, many still failed to believe, which led to other trials and lessons by God. The result for the Egyptians and the other ancient people of the region was a dread of the God of Israel. Pharaoh once again hardened his heart and sent his chariots after the Israelites. When God opened a way through the Red Sea for the Israelites, then drowned all of Pharaoh's armies here, the power of Egypt was crushed, and the fear of God spread through all surrounding nations. Joshua 2:9-11. This was the very purpose that God declared at the beginning. We can still look back at these events today to confirm our faith in and our fear of this true and living God, the judge of all earth. Consecration of the Hebrew firstborn, Exodus 13. The Lord required the firstborn male to be consecrated to him. All firstborn of human beings and animals belong to God. For animals, they are sacrificed to the Lord. For some, they are redeemed by other animal. But the human beings are to be redeemed by a sacrifice of animal. Crossing the Red Sea, Exodus 14-15. The single most important redemptive event in Israel's history. This is the foundation story of the birth of Israel as a nation. All roots point to this foundational event. God has liberated his people and continued the Israelites as constituted the Israelites as a nation. Thus, in the redemption story, we find that the promise of God since the beginning is now being fulfilled. The promise of is now beginning to take shape. Importance to Christians. Jesus is the Paschal Lamb. This image is very important to Christians. In the Gospel and in the other letters, we find Jesus the Paschal Lamb. It had tied up with Exodus story about the avenging angel of death. In memory of this Exodus, the Jews are required to remember this Passover and to be retold to generations to follow, so that they would not forget the love of God for his people. The liberation wrought by God to the Israelites is now applied to the Gentiles through the passion and death and resurrection of Christ. Through his death, the dominion of sin in the flesh has been defeated by the self-giving surrender of Jesus' flesh, over which sin has no claim, as Jesus is sinless. When he surrendered his body, sin was defeated. In Catechism number 1094 and 1221, we find 1094. It is in this harmony of the New Testaments that the Pastoral Catechesis of the Lord is built, and then that of the Apostles and the Fathers of the Church. This catechesis unveils that what lay hidden under the letters of the Old Testament, the mystery of Christ. It is called typological because it reveals the newness of Christ in the base of the figures or types which announces him in the deeds, words, and symbols of the first covenant. By this rereading in the spirit of truth, starting from Christ, the figures are unveiled. Thus, the flood of Noah's Ark prefigured the salvation by baptism, as did the cloud and the crossing of the Red Sea. Water from the rock was the figure of the spiritual gifts of Christ, and manna in the desert prefigured the Eucharist, the true bread from heaven. 1221. But above all, the crossing of the Red Sea, literally the liberation of Israel from the slavery of Egypt, announces the liberation wrought by baptism. You freed the children of Abram from the slavery of Pharaoh, bringing them dry shod through the waters of the Red Sea, to be an image of the people set free in baptism. The Passover or the Seder is the reenactment of the Exodus, where the Jews remember what happened on that crucial day before they are freed from Pharaoh. They are to partake of the unleavened bread, the roasted lamb, geared to flee at an instant notice. The Seder was celebrated by Christ before he had his passion, death, and resurrection. On that Holy Thursday, he enacted the Seder, which will find its actual reality on Good Friday, when he was immolated at the cross. In the Synoptic, we find the image of the Eucharist discussed by Christ as his body and blood, and in John 6, we find the intensity of this reality. Thus, at Good Friday, the fulfillment of the Seder in the crucifixion was completed, and the wrong man has done to God's dignity was restored by the filial obedience of the Son. Provision in the desert, Exodus 16:17. Manna. When the Israelites were asking for food in the desert, he provided them manna from heaven. In Deuteronomy 8:16, we find the purpose for this, which the manna was given. Feed you in the wilderness with manna that your ancestors did not know, to humble you and to test you, and in the end to do you good. Deuteronomy 8:16. In Paul's 2 Corinthians 2:9, we find an echo of this test applied to the Corinthians, whom Paul loved very much. The term manna is from the Hebrew manhu, meaning what is it? The fathers of those in the wilderness had not encountered anything like it. That provision from God is what sustained them before they entered into the promised land. In John 6, called the Bread of Life Discourse, John was emphasizing that Jesus is the bread of life and that came down from heaven. The Jews know the manna which came down from heaven. When Christ said that whoever eats of the flesh of the Son of Man and drinks his blood will have eternal life, they found occasion to reject him. Peter said when asked whether they will leave him, Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. The message of the pericope is trust in the Lord, just as Peter did. The teaching applies to us too. Victory over enemies. Battle against the Amalekites. Chapter 17. In this pericope, we find the story of the battle with Amalek. On top of the hills, Moses held up the staff and Israel prevailed. But when he was tired, he lowers the staff and Amalek prevailed. Thus Aaron and Hur put stones under Moses and held up the hands of Moses. Thus, by sundown, Amalek was defeated. Conclusion: freedom from slavery and to free life as God's children. Some may ask why it took too long for Israel to be free. The Israelites even forgot him. However, we find that there is no point in freeing a people who don't believe they need freedom. This is something people have to take up for themselves. Otherwise, they fall into another form of slavery.
Alright, kung meron pong tanong, we can divide ourselves into the groups muna. And then, balik tayo before mga 40, 9:40 for discussions. Ano ba? Ilan tayo lahat? 21, tatlo lang. Divide you into 3 groups.
ay yung prehistoric era na tungkol doon sa bago dumating Egyptian era, yung Egyptian period. Meron doon ako na yung 15,000 to 10,000 BC Stone Age na ang aking binibigyan din doon ay kung saan ang mga tao sa panahong iyon ay wala pang edukasyon, wala pang pagkilala sa mga bagay-bagay sa paligid. Kaya ang nangyari, sila ay nag-uusap sa pamagitan ng mga sinyas kasi wala pa silang mga letra or wala pang mga, yung kailang means of communication, pasinyas lang. Ngayon, ang punto ay pwede bang sabihin natin na doon nagsimula yung pagkakaroon ng Diyos-Diyosan dahil siyempre wala silang alam kung paano nila makikilala yung mga bagay sa labas. Yung bakit ang araw ay sisikat, tataas, naliwanag, lulubog. So yun ang kailang mga sinasamba doon. Then yung mga hayop na kailang nakita sa araw-araw sa kanilang paligid, yun ang kailang drawing sa loob ng kuweba na kanilang titigilan. Then yun yung kailang mga sinasamba dahil hindi nga nila makatulad ng puno, ng bato, ng ibon, ng ulap, hindi nila maipaliwanag yun na kailang kaisipan. Kaya sinasamba nila yun. Ngayon, pwede bang...
Ang tawag doon, Sir Romeo, ang tawag doon, animism.
Ayun po, yan. Thank you, bro.
Yung mga sumasamba sa bato, sa puno, sa kahoy, sa kalikasan. Ang religion po nila noon ay tinatawag na animism. Animism po tawag doon.
Thank you, bro. Pwede ba, bro, na yun ay i-connect natin doon sa, na nung dating yung panahon ni Moses sa Paraon, yun pa rin ang ina-adapt ng mga Egyptian, yung mga yung mga artifacts na yun. Kaya mayroong mga Diyos-Diyosan.
Oo, kasi sumasamba sila sa mga halimbawa sa ilog, no? Yun, yung ilog Nile, kinikilala nilang Diyos yun. Yung ahas, kita mo yung mga noon ng mga Egyptian, may ahas, sumisimbolo yun sa eternity yung ahas na yon. Tapos sumasamba din sila sa mga iba't ibang uri ng hayop, no? Yung baka, yung mga ganon, yun. Kaya yung during that time, ang religion ng araw, animism, no? Kung alin yung nakikita nilang may buhay na akala nila yun ang Diyos, sinasamba nila yon. Ang tawag doon ay animism.
Pwede kung ano yung nakakatulong
sa kanila.
Opo, yung kung ano yung nakakatulong sa kanila ng bibigay sa kanila ng kaginhawahan or mga biyaya, tumutulong halimbawa sa kanilang buhay, inaano nila, parang sinasabi nila may above sa kanila na hindi nila
mahina si sister.
Oo. Above po sa kanila na hindi nila kayang ipaliwanag, kaya inaano nilang maging Diyos. Pero gayon pa man, sabi nga, sumasalin siya, nag-i-evolve. Pagdating po doon sa Egypt time, meron na silang system. Kumbaga, meron na silang mga study, meron na silang, kumbaga, kumbaga, may pinuprove na sila, kumbaga, parang, ay, ito nga talaga, meron talagang ganitong Diyos. Or yan, yung Diyos ng araw, yung pinakamataas sa kanila doon sa Egypto. Tapos, yung diniscuss nga ni Kuya Resty kung saan yung 10 plagues yun yung kumbaga tumalo or pinapakita ng ni Adonai na higit siyang makapangyarihan doon sa lahat ng Diyos. Doon sa ilog Nile kanyang pinadugo, kumbaga nagkaroon ng dumugo siya, kumbaga na-defeat or natalo ni Adonai yung Diyos ng river. And then yung sa mga plagues nga na sinasabi, yun ay tumutumbas doon sa mga Diyos-Diyosan ng Ehipto kung saan ipinapakita ni Adonai sa bansang ito na merong iisang Diyos at makapangyarihan ito na hindi pwede nilang mapantayan. So, doon, yun. Maaari nga pong sabihin doon sa unang mga tao sa Stone Age kasi wala pang sapat naman na pag-aaral na pwede nilang i-consider siya, kino-consider nilang Diyos Hanggang sabi nga naman di ba, ang revelation ng ating Panginoon sa ating mga tao ay unti-unti, hindi siya biglaan. So hanggang sa nag-evolve, nakikita din natin na yung mga binigay sa atin na mga katuruan, yung revelation, yung revelation ng Diyos sa ating buhay, nagiging napapanghawakan na natin. Bagamat di natin nakikita, pero napapanghawakan natin na meron ngang Diyos at iisa na may makapangyarihan, tapos na may sumusunod-sunod na yung tatlong persona at sa mga katuruan pa ng ating simbahan. Yan po.
Sir Romeo Lotero, no, batay sa aking mga libro na nandito, ang Egyptian, naging monotheistic yan during that time, no? Na kinikilala nila na iisang Diyos na makapangyarihan sila sa lahat, si Akhenaton, no? Si Aton, tinatawag na Aton. Monotheistic yan dati during that time. Kung i-research nyo, no? Tinatawag lang Akhenaton. Yun ang paniniwala na iisang Diyos. Si Aton. God of all, na walang ibang Diyos sa kanya. Monotheistic dati yan during that time, no? Kung di ako nagkakamali, during that time ng Imhotep, kay Imhotep yan, no, na nakilala nila.
Si Imhotep.
Si Akhenaton na bilang iisa at talagang Diyos na walang katulad na makapangyarihan sa lahat. Kaya tinatawag nila itong God of Aton. Tapos nung namatay ito, napalitan na naman ibang ayun, bumalik na naman ito sa pagiging polytheistic. I-research niya yan sa Google kung mali ako. Mali yung libro rito sa akin.
Polytheistic po ba?
I-research nyo.
Kasi natalakay namin natin si Imhotep yung mga yung
si Aton ang kinikilala nila, si Akhenaton, tinatawag nila ito na iisang Diyos na makapangyarihan sa lahat, walang katulad, no? Possible na itong mga itong mga Israelita during that time baka doon nila nakita yung na yun.
Brother Mel.
Yes.
Tinignan ko lang kasi yung animism.
Ha?
Tinignan ko lang yung sinabi mo yung animism.
Sumasamba sila sa mga...
Ang animism pala, yung paniniwala na lahat ng bagay, may espiritu.
Yes.
Nabubuhay o yung mga bagay na walang buhay. At lahat ng religion na yung pagano, isa form of animism kasi ang mga ganon din naniniwala na...
Yes, lahat ng sinasamba nila.
Ang buwan. Naniniwala sila may espiritu yan.
Animism yan.
At mismo sa Bible, nare-relate pa yung animism dahil yung divine spirit na sinasabi natin na ay
lahat ng may buhay na nila. Halimbawa, yung bato na lumalaki, di ba mayroong batong buhay na lumalaki? No.
Opo, mayroon.
Sinasamba rin nila yon. Akala nila Diyos yon. Tapos yung mga punong malalaki na matatayog, akala nila nandoon yung espiritu ng Diyos. Kaya yung tubig na buhay na dumadaloy, sinasamba nila.
Pero si Brother Mel, ang animism, hindi religion.
Yun po yung belief nila, belief po nila yun. Paniniwala nila yun. Hindi yung religion. That is the belief. Belief nila yun, belief. Yung animism na yun. Yung paniniwala sa lahat ng may buhay na akala nila ay nandoon yung mga espiritu, yun po yung animism. During that time, no? During that time, yung Pilipinas animism yan, no? No? Sumasamba sa mga anito, sumasamba sa kung saan-saan, animismo ang ating bansang Pilipinas during the time na may mga nauna pang mga ethnic group dito. Animism sila.
Yan lang po.
Parang bro yung mga yung sinasabi ni Tigam na Subanon sa atin. Sa Sambuanga Subanon. Subanon tribe.
Yun yan. Yung Pilipinas ng araw, no, mga pagan yan, no, sumasamba yan sa mga kalikasan. Kaya tinawag silang mga animism.
Salamat bro, salamat.
Tsaka during the time ng unang mga civilization, may mga kinikilala na yung mga Diyos.
Kuya Froilan, meron kang gustong sabihin, Kuya Froilan? Naka-off yung mic mo po, naka-off. Yan.
Ayos na lang yung makikinig ako. Wala akong matanong. Marami ako natututunan sa pakikinig.
Kuya Tony, meron ka bang isi-share?
Sis, wala. Nakikinig lang ako.
Madinig namin ang boses mo.
Oo.
Kuya Dado, ikaw, Kuya Dado. Meron kang ano dyan, inspiration.
Meron po ako ulang tanong.
Sige po, Kuya.
Kasi yung paniniwala ng iba, yung Egyptian daw, kasi sa ngayon, yung mga architecture natin ay mabagsak sa lindol. Pero yung pyramid ay hanggang ngayon ay wala pa itang gumuguhong pyramid pero natuklap lang ibang bahagi. So, ano yung kanilang kayang claim na parang ang mga Egyptian daw ay mga alien? Ito kaya ay ano? Ano po dito?
Yung alien, wala pong makakapagpasabi, wala
Meron ako ritong The Beginning of Life na gawa ng Broiler Encyclopedia, no? Base doon, ang gumawa ng pyramid, 300,000 na mga Hudyo. Yung mga, di ba, naalipin sila sa Ehipto? Yung 300,000 na mga worker ng mga alipin sa Ehipto, ayon doon sa libro na yon, nandito sa akin, yung The Beginning of Life ang title, mga 300,000 na mga slave na Hudyo ang naggawa noon. No,
pero ang
Nabitin.
Alright. Meron pong tanong na kung napag-usapan ninyo doon sa loob. Baka meron gusto kayong i-clarify. Mag-uusapan natin yan.
Sir Risty.
Yes po.
Tutuloy ko lang yung tanong ko kanina na medyo nabitin. Kasi,
sorry.
Doon sa Egyptian na gawa ng pyramid, tama yung sinabi ni Bromin na 300,000 yung mga sinaliping mga Hudyo na gumawa doon. Pero ang alam ko rin yata, more than 100,000 years na ginawa yung pyramid eh. Ay ang tanong po doon ay, totoo po kaya na iyon ay mga alien yung mga Egyptian na sinasabi? Kasi mahabang lig eh. Mahaba kasi mga lig na mga Egyptian eh.
Well, kung pag-uusapan natin yan, ibang topic yan, pero pag-uusapan natin kung gusto nyo. Kaya lang, papasok ba tayo sa alien? Hindi ko yan sa mga non-canonical kanyang na yan yung question na yan. Pwede yung pag-usapan yan kung gusto nyo, mag-meet tayo ng hiwalay dahil kanyan parang
Terrestre.
Yes, sir.
Yung mga Israelita, mga alien yun di ba? Naalipin sila ng mga Ehipto sa lupain nila. Kaya hindi naman sila, kaya alien yun. Yung mga
alien yun. Sinasabi
mga Pilipino, mga Pilipino na napunta sa Amerika, na nag-TNT, mga alien yun.
Mga migrant
Oo, mga alien yun.
Brother Mel.
Pero yung alien na napapanood natin sa TV, sa mga movie, lang yun, katang-isip lang yun.
Brother Mel, tungkol doon sa gumawa ng pyramid, sabi mo kanina mga Hudyo. Nabasa ko dito sa ginugel ko. Ang sabi ay hindi pinatunay ng mga archaeologists na hindi raw mga slaves ang gumawa ng pyramid kundi mga free workers. Talagang hinire sila, binahayan sila para gawin
dito kasi sa akin, meron kasi ako ritong Book of The Beginning of Life, gawa ng Broiler Encyclopedia. Ang sabi naman dito, 300,000 people na mga Jews ang gumawa.
Ang pyramid?
Opo, sabi po dito sa aking kukunin ko po, babasahin ko po, kukunin ko.
Ang the Cheops, yung Cheops Khufu, the Pyramid of Khufu, hindi yan contemporary with the Jews. Ang mga Hudyo ay nandito lang sa Kwan, mga 3,000 years, mga 2,000 years before. Yung pyramid is more than that eh. So hindi
ano po, Sir Reste, ang sabi ron 300,000 na mga Hudyo daw, mga slave na mga Hudyo ang pinagtrabaho daw doon para daw matayo yung pyramid. Dito sa The Beginning of Life na gumawa ay Grolier Encyclopedia.
Grolier na kwa dyan. Pero hypothetical pa rin yun eh. Kasi ang yun, may mga nagsasabi, alien nga, sabi ni Romy Kangina, mga alien ang gumawa niyan. May nagsasabi sa mga legends ng mga Hudyo na ang ginamit doon sa pag-build niya na hindi necessarily mga sound na ginagamit daw para sa pan. It is actually parang stuff yun doon sa isang TV series, the Ancient Aliens, no? Hindi hindi technically historical ang iba niya na kwan. Now, can they be the slaves na sinasabi? Not necessarily. So, kasi ibang kwan yun eh. How can you build the pyramid with straw? Yung sinasabi sa Biblia, di ba? They have to put in the bricks, which is actually, kwan lang yun ha. Ang brick is actually mud. Mud and yung pampakapit yan is yung straw. Tingnan nyo naman ang laman ng pyramid. Hindi yan straw, hindi yan bricks. Ha? Ang pyramid po ay talagang bloke ng ano. So, if you're going to look at the account of the scripture, ang ginagawa ng mga Hudyo ay magkuha ng mga bricks, no? And the bricks actually made of mud and the straw. Pag tinignan niyo yung material na ginamit sa pyramid, hindi yan brick eh. That's actually stone, massive stones yun. Ayun na ba? So may quarry siguro, pero hindi yung pinapagawa sa kanila. Dahil if you're going to look at the account in the scripture, ang ginagawa ng mga bricks, ang quarrying ng mga stones na yon sa pyramid ay hindi yung ginagawa ng mga Hudyo, basically. Mag-quarry siguro, somebody else, pero hindi necessarily mga Hudyo yun eh. Okay? Sa ancient Near East, okay, pwede silang malapit doon sa malapit sa situation ng or sa lugar ng Israel ang ancient Near East, magkakasama naman sila diyan eh. So pwede siguro naghahanap ng mga trabaho, pwede 'yon kung talagang free men ang gumawa ng pyramid, pwede 'yon.
Ito po yung book, Sir Reste, nabili ko to sa Ito po. The Beginning of Human Life. Ayan gawa ng Grolier.
Kaso sa Google, Brother Mel, 2010 ang sinabi ng mga
sabi dito
ng Egypt.
Ayan po.
Yan, matagal na yata yan, brother eh.
Tagal na te. Luma-luma
Ang latest information ng archaeologist.
Ito po.
As of 2010.
Paano ginagawa?
Hindi naman kwan yun eh. Those are historical ba yan? Yun ang tanong dyan eh.
Apo.
Take a look at that kung historical yun. Kasi ang encyclopedia is compilation of posibleng mga commentaries eh. Ay, kung ang tinitingnan niya kasi natin is yung kung ang mga Israel talaga yung gumawa ng pyramid. Tingnan niyo yung konteksto. Ang nandoon sa Exodus, ang pinapagawa sa kanila ay brick. At yung brick na yon ay galing sa mud na mayroong pampakapit na
alkitran.
Hindi alkitran. Alkitran is ang alkitran is yung naphtha yan eh. That's the naphtha. Ang sinasabi doon is yung brick, meaning mud talaga. At saka yung straw. Kaya nga yung mga bahay doon, pag inulanan to, kaya siguro walang ulan doon eh. Kasi pag inulan yun, mababagsak yun eh, basically.
Brother Steve, makasingit po. Yung pong sa Exodus, ang ginagawa ng mga Israelita, mga supply cities, mga parang mga city yung ginagawa nila, mga mga buildings, hindi pyramid po yung sinabi doon.
Hindi nga kwan yun eh. Kasi without yung pinaka-konteksto nga nung kan na yun, if you're going to look at that, that is the brick, no? That's the brick. And that cannot be the material na ginamit para doon sa pyramid. Because the pyramid is actually made of massive granite stones, no? Mga granite stones yan. In the building of the Temple of Solomon, granite yun. Yes, that's right. Pero yung pag-build noong pa na yun, this is actually during the time of David na, yung pag-build doon sa sinasabing Pitom, no? Yung the city of Ramses. Sabi kasi nila doon, ang ginagawa ng mga Israelita is the city of Ramses, the city building. It's actually possible. Kung mga bahay-bahay lang ang ginagagamitan ng bricks, that's all right. Pero yung tawag dito, pagkuha ng mga stone na ito, wala doon sa scripture nagsasabing nagkuha sila ng granite. Nagkuha sila ng granite. Kaya nga po, titingnan niyo yan from that particular context. Okay, so may mga building na ginawa yung mga, makikita niyo naman yung magagaling yung mga Egyptian sa building priest nila eh. Yung kanilang mga monumento, etc. Pero hindi yan necessarily yung posibleng pinapagawa. Dahil ang nakalagay lang sa scripture na pinapagawa sa kanila is yung bricks, no? Bahay, usually pwede makuha yung bahay yun. Pwede gamitin sa bahay yun. And mga papansin nyo naman, ang mga tiran, mga Egyptian, medyo mga tigas basically. Ang mga Hudyo nakatira lang sa tent yun eh. Kaya nga sabi nga nung isang Hudyo na isang tinatawag interdisciplinary na Hudyo, yung sinasabi niya doon na meaning nung the plague.
Ito po yung nakasulat sa Resti, no?
Yes.
Tama yung sinasabi ni Pajardo, sabi niya, the Great Pyramid was a tomb built for Khufu, second king of 4th dynasty who reigned around 2650 BC, and was one of the most powerful men who ever lived. He had his command all the resources of the country, and it seems clear that the principal event of his time was a building of the pyramid. It was to be a structure which could be penetrated by no human being and which would house forever the remains of the king Herodotus, who lived in 650 century BC, related the Egyptian tradition that 100,000 of men were engaged in its construction for 20 years. And we believe that such was the is. Yan ang sabi dito.
Kaya nga, yun ang ano doon eh. Now, if you're going to look at that from that perspective, yung 3,000 years na yun, 2,600, come on, is actually yung panahon ni Abraham. Basically, panahon ni Abraham yung yun, mga ganong area yung pinagtukuhan. That is legendary yun as far as we are concerned. That's mythical yun eh. Because that's part of the Torah, which is actually mythical. If you're going to look at it from the exegetical perspective, that's a myth, no? So, pag tinan mo yung actual na history, makikita nyo na may mga civilization na merong ganyan. Pero hindi necessarily yung sinasabi na ang mga Israelite na nagkuha doon eh. Marami. Hindi lang necessarily Israel ang gumawa. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, still nursing.
Nakamute ka po, Sis Nursing. Hindi ka po naririnig. Nakamute ka po.
Okay. Agree ako kay Jess kasi nabasa ko din yung latest nila. Actually, ang gumawa ay a group of workers na tinawag na gang. Kaya minsan kasi kung sa book, aywan ko lang kung anong edition ng book na yan, anong year. Ako kasi nakadepende ako dito sa latest na discovery.
Tama po yung sinasabi ni Bro Jess kasi sabi rito, 100,000 men were engaged in the construction for 20 years. No? Hindi sinabi rito kung sila ba ay mga Hudyo o kung sino o mga ganon. Basta sabi mga slaves ang gumawa.
Oo.
No? Okay, tapos nilagyan pa dito ng ano, the immense size of this largest of ancient stone structure will be gathered from the following figures. The area covered the pyramid is about 13 acres. They have been 755 feet on a side. The ground plan is practically square in its accuracy, and that the pyramid as a whole arouses our greatest admiration for the mechanical skill of the architects of the early periods. The pyramid tower to a height of 480 feet, which is equivalent to a modern skyscraper 48 stories high. It is composed of a solid mass of yellow limestone blocks, and the time of its compilation was covered with an outer layer of fine white limestone shining in the sun. It must indeed have pleased and soul of the great king. Hindi po alien yung gumawa.
Kaya nga, yung alien, mga ano na yun, mga baga
Speculation yan, speculation.
Opo. Ayun lang pinag-uusapan, sino yung builder.
Okay yan.
Mga slave daw po, slave, sabi rito, yung mga slave na thousand of men.
Okay.
Ang author po nito ay PhD, tsaka DD, LLD, PhD. Tapos edition po nito ay noong 1951. Hindi pa ako
mas ano na po kami dito sa latest. Sa Google.
Ito po. Ano po ang gumawa nito? Groiler Encyclopedia po. The outline
sa Google kasi updated. Okay, thank you.
Alright. Meron pa po dito sa Canonical natin, ano yung tanong ninyo doon sa present.
Brother, yung palang Brother, nadidinig ba ako?
Yeah. Sige.
Yeah. Yung palang pagkakatawag kay Abraham, it was before he displayed his faith, his trust in God.
Yeah.
Kasi yung testing sa kanya, afterward na tinawag siya.
Yeah.
So nauna muna, na later part na lang siya nagpakita ng kanyang faith in God, being the father of faith, no? Pero before he was called, hindi pa siya tested.
Hindi pa. Although, doon sa Talmud, meron kasing mga istorya sa Talmud na nagsasabi na si Abraham already is a monotheist, meaning meron na siyang inkling sa isang Diyos lang. Kasi doon sa Talmud, merong isang kwento doon na yung natatay niya, si Terah, ay idol maker. Gumagawa ng mga idolos yun Pagkatapos binibenta. Kaya nung sabi sa kanya, dahil may tindahan sila ng mga idols, nung umalis, sabi sa kanya, pagkunan mo yan, bantayan mo yung mga kunan natin. Then pag alis ng tatay niya, sinira niya lahat ng mga idols. Pagkatapos, pagbalik, anong nangyari? Bakit nagdasira-sira itong mga tinitinda natin? Ewan ko, nag-away-away yung mga Diyos-Diyos na yun Kaya yan, nagkanda sira-sira.
Pero,
yeah.
That was, hindi yan sa Bible, ano? Sa ibang,
sa Talmud yan.
Sa Talmud.
Yan po, sa kanya, mga istorya nila dyan yun ang doon, yun ang pagkakaintindi nila. But, apparently, ang conception na si Abraham is a monotheist already by that time, yun ang gusto ipakita doon sa Talmud.
Okay. Brother, may isa pa akong tanong. What's wrong with Esau marrying a Canaanite? Is there something wrong?
Ang kwan kasi dyan, hindi na-conquer nila dapat ang Canaan, di ba? Sa kanila kwan. Although, sa exegesis, sinasabi natin that the Jews may have been part of the local stock, kasama sila sa mga Canaanites. Pero dito sa presentation kasi sa Biblia from the canonical reading, alien yun. Hindi yan mga Hudyo. O hindi yan doon sa tribo nila. So kung ang connotation kasi at that time, you have to marry within the tribe para hindi magkaroon ng extra na lineage or something. Okay? Kaya nga, di ba sa presentation, Even yung si Dina, nung ni-rape, gusto nga maging family, gusto sumama na doon sa mga Israelita, pinatay lahat yun. Dahil nga doon sa incident na si Hamor at saka yung kuhan gusto maging
yung pong si Reste, yung pong pag-rape kay Dina, literature po ba yan o literal talaga na ni-rape?
Literature yan.
Yes, correct.
Kasi,
salamat po.
Ang pa naman is nasa mythological kanyang area na yun. So, yung Torah basically, ha? Okay. So, hindi necessarily kwan yan. Hindi ano ba yung ginawa natin yung
historical,
not necessarily historical. Okay? Meron pa pong tanong so far na gusto nyo i-clarify sa presentation? Alright. So kung gano'n, pwede na tayong mag-close. Makikita-kita lang tayo next week uli para dito sa canonical reading. Tomorrow, meron tayong exegesis.
Salamat po, Sir Reste, sa maraming kaalaman.
Brother, anong coverage ng next session?
Next session, okay. Ang next session will be second part ng Egypt, bibigay ni Lilith, tapos desert wandering, bibigay ni Lita, and the conquest of the conquest and Judges part 1, bibigay ni June. Yung para next one. Now, papabibigay ko na sa inyo responses para sa ito sa 4, 5, and 6. And then, i-compare nyo lang ito sa mga notes ninyo, ha? Okay. Andali lang po.